Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you recognizing how long this process is, and I think our staff would say it actually never stops. I mean, there's this time in June when they get vacations in, and I think then they start working on numbers again. But I did want to thank all of our staff for the hard work they put into this. Lori Allshouse directing this effort. Andy Bowman's in the audience. Lindsay and Laura are not with us, but they put a lot of work into it. And I will say that Jackson and the school staff put a lot of work into this too. And we work very closely together, particularly throughout the 5-year plan process and then leading into the annual budget. So I really want to thank staff. They also have to put up with me throughout the process, which is not the greatest thing in the world, but they do a great job, and everyone has done a tremendous amount of work this year, and particularly this year, because we've had to do some things different. And you're going to hear me talk about that through the presentation. So thanks to everybody for their work, and Bill and Doug and Lee for their work as well. Believe it or not, even Larry Davis and Louise were involved in some thinking on this budget. So lots of good teamwork, and I think a good result with this budget. We hope you'll feel the same way. Before I start talking about FY16, though, take a moment and step back with me in time to the fall and 18 town hall meetings in the magisterial districts to talk to the public and engage them in a discussion about our future. If you look at the screen, you'll see the first slide shows that gap that we talk so much about to the public. That's the gap between our expected projected expenditures and our projected revenues. The top line represents our expenditure projections, and the bottom line represents our revenue expectations without the assumption that we were going to raise taxes for capital. That is in your adopted CIP. The Oversight Committee has recommended that you maintain the projection for tax increases to pay for our capital funds going forward beyond this FY16 that we're talking about. The line above that is if you assume we do raise those taxes as projected, and you'll see the gap is still very significant. So we start this process with FY16 thinking back on the challenges that we were faced with. A couple of the major things that came out of that were the concepts of service districts as a way to think about the future. And again, the main concept there was higher levels of service in certain areas of the county, which might lead to the need to raise taxes in those districts to help pay for these higher levels of services. And then discussion about a bond referendum, put out to the voters the proposal to build certain facilities with the idea that taxes may need to be increased to pay for those. Those are two things that you all asked for more information on. They got a lot of discussion, got feedback from the public. I know a lot of you said that you heard feedback that said, sure, let's talk more about service districts. So those were big things that came out of it. Both of them do involve some discussion about revenues, obviously. The other thing that I remember the most and that I've heard you all reflect on is the moments when we were sitting at the dais and Tom Foley wasn't in his normal seat. He was on the other side, but you had Dan Eggleston, the Chief of Fire Rescue, Steve Sellers, our Police Chief, Kathy Ralston, our Social Services Director, and Robin, one of the principals, talking about the compelling issues they were faced with as they thought about the future and tried to deal with the challenges they were faced with after the recession and with the continued changes that we face going forward. Those were compelling stories. The Albemarle County Police Department ranks 126th out of 133 jurisdictions, law enforcement agencies in Virginia. That puts us at the bottom in terms of our staffing per capita for officers. That's a significant issue. By comparison, the city of Charlottesville provides 5 times more police coverage than the county does in our urban areas. In social services, they talked about being 23.3 positions understaffed by state standards and working at 163% of capacity. Another compelling story, 94% increase in overtime since 2009, and our turnover rate over the period from 2008 to 2014 has gone from 8% to 13.5%. In our school system, From 2009 through the end of that projected 5-year plan, we're projecting 2,000 new students that we'll have to educate. And the number of free and reduced lunch students just in the last 5 years has increased by 1,000 students, or 44%. And similarly, our English as a second language students have increased by 173 students, or 17% in that same 5-year period. Very significant, compelling issues that we face as we thought about the 5-year plan, as we think about the year going forward. To revisit that quickly, the conclusions really are that our projected revenue growth fails to keep pace with the unmet needs and strategic aspirations that we've established. We are operating in a fundamentally redefined relationship with the state of Virginia in terms of their share of funding services. We spent a lot of time in the legislative process this year talking about equal taxing authority and so forth. You're going to hear some news that maybe the state will provide us with some more funding, but don't let that fool you. That is giving us back money that they've cut from us over the last 5 years. We will get some of it back hopefully this year, and that will be a good sign, but it's not new money that moves us forward. It's just helping us with some of the things that have already been reduced. We certainly talked about the need to rebuild critical capacity lost during the recession. Our officers are behind in the neighborhood of 27 officers. Part of that is because of that recession and not being able to continue to make progress. And certainly as we look to the future, enrollment growth continues, and this demographic change in the school system that's requiring higher expenditures is also a part of that conclusion with the 5-year plan. And the overriding conclusion of all of that, in the way that we started this budget look, was we have got to do something different. We can't continue with status quo and make any progress. The compelling case about officer safety in the field is an important one that we have to pay attention to, and we're trying to make some progress on. So we have some challenging choices. These challenging times require that we think differently about the future and that we reconsider both our existing assumptions, our current practices, and also our engagement with the public because of the challenges that we have ahead of us. Real quickly, as we think about doing different things in the future, I want to take just a minute to remind us of the things that we've done in the past. This recession has not been an easy thing to get through. It's required us to do some different things, transform our organization. The chart you see before you talks about the fact that we established an economic development office to try to make some headway in long-term ways of turning our revenue picture around. We've used alternative revenue sources. EMS revenues recovery was in place during this period. We developed new partnerships with the schools and with community agencies and so forth. We established an innovation fund, and we have acquired over $3 million in grant funds. All these things to try to get through, transform the way that we think, and move ourselves forward. But this chart really tells you that as we have added staff back during the recovery that slowly has come along, they've gone to public safety and social services. So we have transformed our organization from the places that we used to have 75 positions that were eliminated to the place where those have gone back to critical core needs. That's going to need to continue as we look forward. As we've mentioned before, our staffing levels right now remain at the 2006 level, even after we've added some positions back. So we clearly have been transforming. And during this time, we have continued with best practices. During the period of the recession, we became one of only 39 counties in the country to get a AAA bond rating. Even in the difficult times, we've focused on financial management and improvement. We remain one of the lowest tax rates among the top 20 localities in terms of population in the state of Virginia. Our average tax bill for the average homeowner since 2009 remains today where it was in 2009. Even though it's dropped and fluctuated some, we still have not exceeded that in the current fiscal year. And we've been recognized for financial reporting in our budget and also for our technology advancements. All these things demonstrate that we have done a lot during this period, even as we look at needing to do some things differently. So with the challenges that we're faced with, we needed to focus on establishing some clear goals to put this budget together, and they are before you. You'll recognize the 3 goals at the top. meeting evolving mandates and obligations, sustaining an efficient, adaptable organization, and building critical capacity that supports quality service delivery. These are things that have been hallmarks of how we've had to approach our budgets over the last 5 to 6 years and are certainly best practice ways to look at how we proceed. The other 3 goals will not be as familiar, and they represent 3 big changes, 3 big different things that we're doing in this budget. The 4th goal, redirect current funding from enhancements to core services. I want to talk about that for just a minute. The compelling case that we talked about with the police department and social services is real. And if we continue with our current assumptions, then we will do all the things we've always done with formulas for funding different services. We needed to question those assumptions, and we did with this. In particular, and I'll talk about it in more detail in a minute, this goal is about redirecting our capital transfer and the monies that go to capital every year, some of that money going back to support core services. There's an impact that we'll talk about, but we have some programs in our CIP which are considered to be expansion of facilities or enhancements of services, and we can no longer continue to transfer what amounts to about $20.2 million over to the CIP while we don't have the level of safety for our officers that we need to have. That's a compelling case, and something needs to change. So this budget looked at moving funds from enhancements to core services, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. The next goal, dedicating any proposed tax increase to specific core services. As we put this budget together, we believe that if we got to the point where we felt like we needed to do this for critical needs, that it needed to be dedicated specifically to core services. So this budget proposes a 1-cent tax increase on real estate, completely solely dedicated to our fire rescue services and the increased demands that they're facing. We are proposing that we pull all those expenditures out of the general fund and create a fire rescue services fund, which we'll talk about in just a minute. That fund will be supported by a 1-cent tax increase as proposed in this budget. And the third idea that's different, we've talked a little bit about this, we've engaged with the public, but we're proposing in this budget that we set up a very specific citizen committee to look at the challenges that we're faced with that graph and that gap, look at our capital needs and those proposed tax increases, look at the compelling case of our operating needs and how far behind we are, and give us some input on some of the ideas that we've talked about. So we are proposing that a citizen committee be formed to report back to this board before the 5-year financial plan, and I'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. So before we get into the goals and how we've met those in this budget, I'd like to shift to a quick overview of our expenditures and revenues and tell you some of the things that are going on there. What you see before you is a pie chart which represents our proposed $370,686,000 budget. As you see and have seen in past years, that budget is principally made up in terms of our revenues from property taxes at 43%, which is primarily real estate and personal property taxes, and other local revenue makes up about 27% that, and the lion's share of that is sales tax and meals tax, hotel motel tax, and those types of things. And then you can see 21% of our revenues projected in this budget are from the state, federal revenues at 4%, our use of fund balance at 3%, and then some borrowed proceeds for capital projects. As you look at the expenditure side of the equation, that $370 million, again, which is fairly typical, about 54% of our total expenditures go to the school system for operations, debt service, and the capital program. The remaining 42% goes to general government and all our other services, and the city of Charlottesville gets about 4% through the revenue sharing agreement that's in place. Some of the highlights of the total expenditures: it does represent a 5.3% increase for FY 2015. That breaks down to about a 3.5% increase in combined operating expenditures. Again, we're talking about schools, local government, everything that we do. And this capital budget is up about 17.2%. It is balanced on a 80.9-cent tax rate, which represents a 1-cent increase. Our revenue growth is modest this year, General fund revenues, which is where all the growth comes from real estate and personal property and so forth, is up about 3.2%. You all, I think, obviously heard the news, and we provide you information that our real estate reassessment that we expected to be about 1.9% of an increase was a little bit better. It came in at 2.3. Nothing to write home about, but everything's positive. As you add new construction to that, we're looking at a total increase in values of about 2.6%, which is reflected in that 3.2 overall increase. Those numbers in total do reflect the 1-cent tax increase dedicated to fire rescue and our state and federal revenues, which are essentially flat. Just to look a little bit more closely at our general fund revenues, where all the growth occurs, you can see that at the bottom right-hand corner is the 3.2% increase we talked about. It breaks down the top line on general property taxes up about $6.5 million. Our total increase is about $7.6 million. So you can see basically what I've said in summary, which is that most of this is coming through general property taxes, some slight increases in some other areas, but a total increase of about $7.6 million or 3.2%. On the expenditure side, if you look again at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see the 5.3% increase in total expenditures that I mentioned. That is a total of about $18.6 million in increased expenditures. That change in general government operations is up about 6.9% or million dollars or 6.2%. Schools are up about $5.3 million in this proposal, or about 3%. And as you look at the capital project number in terms of the change, you'll see that there's about $6.7 million of additional capital funds in this total expenditure pie. So that's just a brief overview of sort of the big picture, all funds considered. As we look at the goals again, what I'd like to do at this point is really talk about our budget and how it's changed according to the goals and what we've tried to accomplish and have accomplished with this proposal. We'll start off with meeting our mandates and obligations. This budget provides a $4 million increase to the school system, or 3.6% in the local support and local transfer to the school funds. It reduces the funding gap originally presented by the superintendent from $3.2 million down to $1.25 million. And just to explain that briefly, that's a reflection of the reallocation of that penny from capital back to operations. That's split 60-40, so they benefited from that. We'll talk about that more in just a minute. And it also represents the stronger values from reassessment and how that's impacted the transfer to the school system. They still have this gap of $1.25 million. We do expect some additional funding from the state. We don't know how much that's going to be yet, but we'll have to monitor that closely to see how that will also help fill in this gap. This budget also meets mandates and obligations by funding full-year impacts of things that have been approved previously by the board, water resource protection mandates, the transportation planner, and the 2 Commonwealth's Attorney Office positions that were just recently approved, the full-year impacts of the Northside Library, which is going to open here very shortly. We've had a lot of increases in library expenses in our operating budget over the last several years for priority issues the board wanted to get done that had been put off for a long time. It also begins to reflect the operating impact of the regional firearms training facility, which is going to be getting underway during this period as we look at the year ahead. One significant increase in terms of these obligations is our contribution to the jail, the regional jail. As you can see, that increase of 19%, very large number, $600,000. We are hopeful that this new state revenues will reduce this somewhat, and there is some discussion about how our partners are working together that might also impact this somewhat. We'll talk about that when we get into our work sessions. I hope this is an area we might be able to reallocate some of our monies. This budget does also move forward with a projected $1.2 million in our capital funds to implement a solid waste solution. It may not be the ultimate long-term one, but it's one that we have some estimates on that are general at this point about perhaps continue a transfer station operation at the Ivy Center, but with some new facilities that are more efficient. So we do have some money set aside for that. Our second goal of sustaining an efficient and adaptable organization, this budget includes professional development and training money for our employees. It continues funding our innovation and grants leveraging funds, which have a big return for the dollars we put into them. It addresses essential departmental operating needs, which have been scrutinized through our modified zero-based budgeting every year, looking at every expenditure. It begins to fund the problem that we've experienced without much for salary increases over time, a compression, which really means that we're hiring new people in almost at the same place that existing employees have been for some time. So we have to try to address that. It begins with a study and sets aside some money to help with that going forward. It does reflect your video streaming decision of recent days and the expenses there, not a dramatic increase there. And one thing I wanted to point out, that this budget continues to look at efficiency in a way that we haven't done before, and that is the schools and local government through my office and Pam's are going to work together and form a team to evaluate how we're doing business and how we can do business together more efficiently. We have both looked independently at efficiency. I think now we need to look across the organizations in a renewed way, look at and see if there's any other areas that we might need to consolidate, or see one of us or the other picking up expenses that will in the long run save us money. There are also a number of other ideas floating out there that we're going to form a team to look at. So again, it continues that commitment in the year ahead. Our goal about building critical capacity, this budget does include a targeted 2.3% salary increase or higher based on performance to begin in January. I want to say right now that our recommendation is that if we get any additional revenues back from the state, that we first put those towards accelerating the pay increase for our employees to October 1st. That is when our health insurance increases will kick in, and we think that there's real opportunities on the school and local government side to move that to October 1st. So I just wanted to mention that as a recommendation as we start talking through the work sessions. This budget, in terms of critical capacity and building that back somewhat, does include 6 total police officers, a crime analyst, and 5 patrol officers, and includes 2 social service workers. It increases administrative support for our customer service center and our legislative and financial management operations, some things that have suffered over the years. There's restoration of support capacity with a policy analyst, a zoning enforcement position in community development, a maintenance mechanic, stormwater inspector, and an IT position, which we think will help advance some of our technology things to a place that we'd like to go. It does provide funding for the Places 29 Small Area Plan to focus on the Route 29 Rio interchange area and looking at our land use planning coupled with our transportation changes that are going on there. And it provides funding to support the Route 29 Solutions Business Assistance Program that we're developing. We've set some money aside to help pay for that. In terms of our goal, our 2 big goals I'd like to talk just a few minutes about here in a more specific kind of way. Redirecting current funding from enhancements to core services. This budget redirects funding from enhancements and expansion projects in our CIP to critical core operating needs of schools and local government. It reduces our $20.2 million total capital transfer by $1.6 million, or the value of a penny, to try to address some of these compelling issues that we've talked about. That money will be reallocated back, and we would not be able to afford to provide funding for enrollment growth, police staffing, human service needs, compensation, and some of these mandates without the value of that $1.6 million coming back. So that's the things we're able to fund in here are a direct result of this proposal. Let's look carefully, though, at the impact on our CIP to be sure that we know what's going on there and what's not going on there. The funds are redirected from our ACE program, our school modernization, and our sidewalk construction. However, this budget does support the upcoming year to match available grants and provide essential classroom improvements so that we don't abandon those completely right now, particularly if we can bring down some matching funds from the state. The sidewalk program also continues with the revenue sharing match that we'll get from the state for this one last year as we begin to have a community conversation about the future. This is one-time money, and you'll notice that the CIP has no funding in the out years for any of these projects until we have a community conversation. It also is able to address the needs in the CIP with this redirection by liquidating some projects. We have some projects that we have eliminated because they are no longer needed. We have continued to scrub our CIP year after year. One thing in particular that's a good example of this is we have, for the last 5 years, have set aside monies to replace ambulances for the Charlottesville Albemarle Rescue Squad. But our policy is that you have to co-title those vehicles in order for the CIP to help pay for them. They have not agreed with that policy, so this money has been sitting there with the idea that it might change. We have liquidated those dollars and let them roll back to the fund balance to pay for our critical needs. That could come forward again when they decide that they're willing to follow that policy, but obviously in this 5 years they've been able to buy ambulances with the fundraising that they've done. So that's an example of us scrutinizing some spending. In past years we'd said, we better leave that alone. That's about a volunteer agency. This year we're saying after 5 years we need to liquidate. Another way that we're doing some things differently. It also eliminates projects without detailed plans or clear timelines. We've set some money aside for things like master plan implementation, but don't have detailed plans about how we're going to proceed with those. So we've liquidated some things there to also help this situation. We'll talk about these in detail at the work sessions. It's important as we look at those projects to talk about what we have not cut because the rest of the CIP is intact. This budget, the CIP continues to fund the core projects that are necessary as well as our maintenance program. We continue to have the money set aside for the court project. We continue to be focused on our maintenance and replacement needs for schools and general government. The upgrade to the ECC 911 system is in here. Hollymead Dam, school safety updates. The Western Albemarle Environmental Studies Academy Phase 1 project is included. And we begin the process of preparing for the Pantops Fire Station and some renovations to the Berkmar Rescue Squad building, which is providing service for us now. So I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea that we're robbing the capital program and doing things that don't make good financial sense. That's not what we're doing here. We're continuing our commitments. Our second major proposal is to dedicate any proposed tax increase to specific core services. Again, that core service theme. This budget establishes a separate Fire Rescue Services Fund, which provides complete transparency for our fire rescue expenditures, one of the largest increases in our budget over the last 15 years. And let me say for very good reasons and for high-value services that we have provided to our community to help supplement our volunteer system. We're going to talk a minute about how that's changed over time. It combines all the revenues and expenditures and provides the capability of us to track our expenditures going forward. The Pantops Fire Station will add expense. This fund will help us to look really at what service increases are in place and what the cost of that is in a more transparent and clear way than we do if it was a part of the general fund. It proposes a 1 cent dedicated tax increase and allocates the current expenditures in our budget, which are equivalent to 6.6 cents on our tax rate. So it moves the value, the 6.6 cents, into a totally separate fund, and that fund will grow as the values on property equivalent to 6.6 cents grows. So it's an automatic way to let some growth in revenues pay for some of those future expenditures that we know we're going to have. The EMS revenues and the growth there are also in that fund. So we'll talk again specifically about how that fund looks in terms of its revenues and expenditures. It also obviously dedicates that 1 cent. So there'll be a total of 7.6 cents dedicated to this fire rescue fund. I think that helps our public understand how much they're really putting into that service. Some of the major highlights in there of the increases, which do total at least $1.6 million is our growing capital expenses that are in the CIP. We're going to pay for those out of this fund. Increasing support for our volunteer services. That includes increase to their operating expenditures and some increased dollars for training in other areas. And one of the major things going on here is that this penny on the tax rate is going to go to help replace $743,000 of expiring grants to pay for 9 firefighters and turnout gear for our entire system. About $135,000 worth of money is expired in terms of our replacement turnout gear for our firefighters. So those are big drivers in here, the capital, the loss of these grants, and then things like the actual increase because of the proposed compensation increase of 2.3%. That's also obviously in that fund for our existing staff. This fund totals $14.5 million in the proposed budget. 13.8 of that is operations, and about $650,000 is going to take care of those capital needs. I just want to talk for just a minute. If you look at the map before you, and on the screen is probably the best way to see it. If you look at that, the green and the yellow colors there, this is where we existed in terms of our response in our development areas and immediately around those areas before 2000, year 2000. The yellow areas represent both our development areas as well as areas that did not have coverage to meet our standards. So the areas where we were funneling all of our growth and putting our infrastructure had no fire stations, with the one exception of the star that you see in green, and that's the Seminole Trail Volunteer Fire Department, the one volunteer station that covered a significant development area. And at that time, our first firefighters were at Seminole to help support them because of the call volume. We had 5 firefighters in 1999. What we have done from 1999 to 2015 is represented on the next map. We have literally put a system in place to cover our development areas where most of our population was. Those stars represent the fire stations that we've put in place. Monticello was the first one that went in. Then we put the one in at Hollymead. Obviously, Seminole was already in place, and we've recently opened the Ivy Station. As you see, there's still one yellow area, and that's Pantops. We are starting with the design this coming fiscal year for the Pantops Fire Station. The importance here is we have literally built a combination system that helped to supplement the volunteers, provide better service in both the rural areas and the development areas, but it has cost us some money, and it's one of the reasons we thought it was important to pull this expense out and talk about it in terms of its value on the tax dollar today, and also so that we can monitor it as we go forward, particularly as we move to putting the Pantops station in place. This is not about escalating costs. This is about dramatic improvements in our most core services. And I can tell you our folks have done a fantastic job and do a good job every single day in protecting our citizens and our property in this community. So they're to be applauded. The thing I want to talk to you about is some of those changes that have occurred, just so you understand. The volunteer support that we have provided over this period has been for marketing and recruitment, fire and EMS training opportunities, operational funding. We moved from them raising funds to us picking up 100% of their operating funds based on a formula. And we've added daytime career staffing to Berkmar Rescue, Scottsville Volunteer Rescue, East Rivanna. We had already had daytime help at the Seminole Trail Fire Department when we started this process. Overall system enhancements, replacing aging apparatus and an enhanced overall fleet. Again, we didn't have the kind of CIP we had when we started this. We have replaced and kept the equipment up to date in volunteer and career stations. We've enhanced our career staffing at Earlysville, Stony Point, and Seminole Trail. We've added the 3 fire stations that I mentioned. And we've enhanced our EMS service, providing daytime service in Earlysville, Pantops, and Ivy, and 24/7 service at Monticello, Hollymead, and Seminole. These last 3 to 4 years have been significant in addressing the EMS response needs and have been a big driver over the last 5 years in terms of our expense. With all of this going on and this high level of service that we've struggled to help provide, we still remain one of the lowest fire departments in cost per capita as we compare ourselves with our benchmark localities. So I think our staff's doing a great job, and this is a real success story, but also a reason for us to pull this out and look at it separately. And if we're going to dedicate tax increases, we should dedicate it to services like this that our citizens can fully be aware of and see where the dollars are going. Our final goal in sort of bringing this overview to conclusion is creating a structured community dialogue to help us as we think about this future, which this budget does not begin to fully address. It takes some important steps. It starts doing some different things. I think we're going to have to continue to think about this. It proposes the creation of a citizen committee to focus on long-term funding alternatives to meet our unmet needs, particularly our unfunded capital needs. There are 4.2 cents of tax increases in the 5-year CIP based on what was adopted last year and what the Oversight Committee has put forward. Those are in there because of the needs that they have seen. They've proposed some things to you. It's not inconsistent with what we've recognized in the past. For them to look at these compelling operating needs and even to look at our strategic aspirations. We've been talking so much about core. This community is a quality of life community, and we have to protect that. We have to keep thinking about it and thinking about what that means for our future, in addition to just keeping up and catching up. Possible areas for consideration have been talked about, having them look at service districts, bond referendums, alternative sources of new revenue, and any other solutions or opportunities that are out there. I think some of you all have some different ideas on things we should put on the table. We would propose to come to you with a more specific charge after we talk to you during this budget process to determine if that's the way you want to proceed. On our compelling operational needs, just want to say that in terms of officers, we've tried to make some progress. We've approved 5 in the current year, proposing 5. That would be 10 over 2 years. If we go back 4-year period, there'll have been 17 new officers. Even with that, population continues to grow. Chief Sellers has indicated that it's about 10 more officers after this proposal that he feels like would put him in a position where he feels much more comfortable about officer safety, the backup that's needed, given the changes and the things they were trying to accomplish. So that's just a perspective thing. We think our department heads should come and talk to this committee. I'd like to get our financial advisors involved in helping advise them on some things and some alternatives. But this is the other big proposal that we have. Our third big proposal is how we tackle this looking to the future. So the goals I've just reviewed and how we've achieved them represent in essence the recommended budget for FY16. And with this proposal in perspective, you see a familiar chart about the tax bill for the average homeowner. For the first time since 2009, with this 1 cent tax increase and this 2.3% increase in values of properties, we will exceed the 2009 tax bill. So you can see how that's trended, and now it's up in 15. Even with a 1 cent tax increase, that amounts to $23 change in the tax bill for that average homeowner. And even with the positions that we've proposed in this budget, our per capita staffing levels remain below FY 2007. We have gained efficiencies in this budget over the last numbers of years, and even now our numbers of staffing per capita still remain at a level below 2007. As we look at our tax rate comparisons, which we've done before, you can see our new tax rate of 0.799 cents this current year and where we stand against the top 20 localities in terms of population. Even with this 1 cent increase, we will remain in the same position below those localities with a higher rate, which are the benchmark localities that are facing the same kind of struggles that we are. This grouping is important. Rockingham, Frederick, Pittsylvania, Augusta, and Bedford are not facing the same urbanizing challenges that we are. James City might be the one exception. and they are right there with us on the tax rate and facing the same kind of struggles. Everybody else, with the exception of Hanover, is at least 5 cents higher on tax rate. Hanover is just above us at 80 cents. So just in conclusion on the recommended budget, this budget does begin to address our most pressing issues based on some new approaches and some challenging choices. And believe me, we understand that this community supports things like ACE and sidewalks and improving our schools. But we didn't feel like we could continue to do that while we had the kind of challenges that we face in the operating side on critical core services. This budget maintains a focus on efficiency and innovation. I mentioned the Innovation Fund continues, the Grants Matching Fund continues, and we have a whole new effort this year with a joint local government schools internal review committee that I mentioned earlier. And we want to engage the citizens at a higher level in a way that we think is probably the most effective on a complicated issue, which is to form a citizen committee. We would ask that if you want to move forward with this, that we really look at the qualifications of folks that have some knowledge in finances or economics, some things that will really help us look at how to crack this nut, what options there might be out there to do some things differently. So there's the gap again. We started, we finished with it. We've done some things to try to help the situation, some different things, but this is the picture that we need to really focus on for the future. I want to leave you with something I mentioned earlier. There is news from the state that seems to indicate that our chances are reasonably good to get some more money for teachers, to get some more money, hopefully, back that the state gave us and then told us we had to give back to them. Maybe they'll give some of it back to us again. That is not in this budget right now. It was a $350 million cut that we had to take. If that money comes back, aid to localities is the cut that they've given us, then we hope that that could improve the situation. I don't have a good handle on the school number for teachers, and the proposal is still floating around. I know that Jackson's probably hoping that I won't put a number out there, so I won't. But that's something we're going to continue to monitor. On the schools and local government side, we have talked together at the staff level, and I know the school board has talked about this. We would love to be able to prioritize a raise October 1st when that health care increase kicks in, and also to get us closer to market sooner because we are behind market. We also, in our CIP, what you'll notice is the modernization of schools is completely gone in every year, including the first year. And that is because this is a proposal that we've been working with the schools on. We would envision being able to accommodate some money in the very first year, not to modernize schools, but to upgrade the atmosphere in the most basic of ways to support the continued conversation of what we should do with modernization going forward, just consistent with what we did with ACE and sidewalks. So we'll talk some more about that, but we are working on that with them right now. We won't need any more money. We believe that we can shift some things around. One example is we've recently gotten news that the state is going to refinance all the school debt through certain bond issues that they did to a lower interest rate. That means every locality that financed through that method will get some money back. We expect that that money will help us to achieve putting some minimal modernization back in. Just wanted you to know that those two things are potential adjustments we'll talk more about. What you have before you now is the engagement process that we have ahead. Madam Chair, you mentioned some of these dates already. The public hearing is on the 23rd of February on this proposed budget. Between the 24th and March 11th, the board will have its work sessions and end up with its budget with any adjustments you've made, and a public hearing on the budget will be held on April 1st. The following week we'll have to have that separate hearing on the tax rate because of state law. Typically we do those on the same night, but we had some challenges with that. We're trying to coordinate with the school spring break issues and so forth. But this is what we have before us. The budget is available on our website, and Madam Chair, at this point I'd be glad to yield for questions. And I think what we typically do with this is to try to give you the overview, give you a lot of reading material, and focus on the work sessions, but I'd be glad to answer any questions and clarifications that are helpful at this point.
Thank you very much.